April 8, 1943. German aces laughed at a lumbering American plane, thinking it was an easy target. But in less than 10 minutes, that flying milk bottle turned their entire squadron into chaos. This is the day the Luftwaffe realized the P-47 Thunderbolt was unkillable. On the day of April 8, 1943, the early morning sun barely pierced the frost-laden clouds over northern France as the 56th American fighter formation clawed its way skyward. At first glance, the scene might have seemed comical to any German pilot scanning from above. A haphazard assembly of Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, each a massive, barrel-shaped machine with wings that seemed almost too small to lift its staggering 7-ton frame. Their engines, the 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp radials, roared like mechanical beasts, straining against the weight of steel and ammunition to climb toward the Luftwaffe formation circling high above. Among the German pilots, veterans of campaigns in Poland, France, and the Eastern Front, laughter escaped easily at the sight of these lumbering American newcomers, whom they derisively called flying milk bottles. But what they could not see, what no mocking glance or casual observation could reveal, was the sheer calculus of destruction contained within those oversized fuselages and underpowered-looking wings. A combination of raw industrial logic and American ingenuity that would, within 18 months, redefine the rules of aerial combat over Europe. At the controls of the P-47s that morning were men who had not yet tasted combat, who had no notion of the terror they would soon unleash, and yet were piloting aircraft that represented an entirely new philosophy, that sheer mass, power, and concentrated firepower could outweigh finesse, experience, and traditional dogfighting techniques. From the German perspective, their sleek Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s, optimized for climb rate, nimble turns, and elegant interceptions, had nothing to fear from these comically ponderous American machines. Oberleutnant Ralph Hermikin of Jageschwader 26, a seasoned ace with more than 24 confirmed kills, peered through the crystal canopy of his FW-190A-5 with barely concealed amusement. Die Amerikaner haben eines Milchflaschen geschicht, he radioed to his wingman, a mixture of disbelief and mockery coding his words. The Americans have sent us milk bottles. He watched, almost lazily, as the P-47 formation labored upward, the radial engines vibrating under immense stress, propellers churning furiously, exhaust streaming back in thick ribbons of smoke. Hermikin could not have guessed that beneath the comical exterior of the Thunderbolt lay 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, each plane capable of delivering 6,000 rounds per minute of concentrated firepower, enough to rip through the fuselage of a Bf-109 or FW-190 in less than 2 seconds if the pilot held his aim steady. The air was cold at 27,000 feet, oxygen masks fogging slightly as American pilots wrestled with their unfamiliar machines, learning to synchronize throttle, propeller pitch, and control surfaces under the cruel tutelage of high-altitude combat. Every motion required brute force and precise timing. Too sharp a turn, and the Thunderbolt's enormous mass would refuse, too slow a climb, and they would be vulnerable to interception. Major Donald Blay, commanding officer of the 335th Fighter Squadron, understood the significance of the moment, the calculus of survival that demanded a complete abandonment of conventional dogfighting doctrine. The P-47 was not built to outturn the enemy. It was designed to shrug off hits, outdive the opposition, and deliver a punishing, uninterrupted fusillade that left no margin for escape. Blay had flown Spitfires as part of the Eagle Squadron, learning the subtleties of British aerial combat, and he knew that the P-47's pilots would have to think differently, fly differently, and fight differently. As the Thunderbolts strained toward the German formation, the Luftwaffe pilots maintained confidence, calculating intercepts and attack angles based on decades of dogfighting experience, unaware that the rules of engagement had already shifted. In favor of the Americans, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, conceived in panic during June 1940 as Nazi forces swept across France, had emerged from a design brief demanding a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching anything the Luftwaffe could throw at it. Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian-born chief designer at Republic Aviation, had approached the brief not with incremental improvements, but with radical rethinking. A monster aircraft with a nearly indestructible airframe, immense radial engine power, and capacity for unprecedented ammunition loads. Kartveli's prototype, the XP-47B, had first flown on May 6, 1941, shocking observers with its sheer size and unexpected agility for such mass. "It will be a dinosaur," he had admitted to his team, "but a dinosaur with proportions that make it lethal." By 1943, that lethality was about to be realized in the French sky. The Thunderbolts climbed steadily, engines screaming against gravity, pilots learning to leverage dive speed, energy retention, and concentrated fire to compensate for inferior turning rates. The German aces, confident in their superior maneuverability, dived eagerly to engage, only to encounter an unexpected reality. The P-47s absorbed hits that would have shredded any other aircraft, trading energy for resilience, and counterattacked with devastating accuracy. At 400 yards, the synchronized Browning machine guns unleashed torrents of lead, cutting into the fuselage, wings, and tail of the attacking fighters. Within moments, jest turned to horror, laughter to panic, as Hermican realized that the milk bottles were no longer slow targets. They were moving fortresses, delivering punishment faster than they could evade. Every dive, every attempted pass, was met with a fury of .50 caliber bullets, forcing experienced Luftwaffe pilots to break formation, retreat, and rethink tactics midair. The mathematics of the air battle, engine power, structural mass, ammunition capacity, dive speed, and pilot decision-making, had shifted irrevocably, and in those critical first minutes, the Americans demonstrated what would soon be undeniable. The P-47 was, for all practical purposes, unkillable in the hands of disciplined pilots applying industrial logic to air combat. The veteran German aces, trained to exploit speed, agility, and tactical cunning, found themselves outmatched by sheer design philosophy, a brutal reminder that in war, innovation and production often outweigh elegance and tradition. By the time the formation descended toward the French countryside, smoke streaks and torn metal marking the sky, the Luftwaffe pilots understood something fundamental. Mockery could not survive against the firepower, resilience, and audacious philosophy embedded in the P-47 Thunderbolt. That April morning did not just mark a clash of aircraft. It marked the moment the Luftwaffe realized that the assumptions underpinning their dominance in the air were suddenly obsolete. The P-47 had arrived, not with finesse, but with the industrial certainty of death, an unkillable juggernaut whose presence would shift the balance of air combat over Europe, heralding a new era where American manufacturing, raw power, and strategic innovation would triumph over even the most experienced and battle-hardened opponents. As the morning sun climbed higher over the rolling fields of northern France, the 56th Fighter Group's P-47s had reached a precarious altitude of 28,000 feet, engines groaning, propellers slicing through thin, cold air, and pilots' faces pale behind oxygen masks. The German formations, led by experienced aces like Oberleutnant Hermican and his wingmen, maintained altitude superiority, circling like predators preparing to strike what they assumed were slow, clumsy prey. Their initial strategy was textbook: dive in from above, attack in tight deflection arcs, and exploit the Thunderbolt's supposed lack of agility. Yet, from the very first pass, reality shattered these assumptions. Major Donald Blay had drilled his squadron on energy fighting. Use gravity to your advantage. Maintain a dive to generate speed that could outpace the attacking FW-190s and keep defensive fire continuous without breaking formation. Even the newer pilots, barely acquainted with combat, quickly learned to treat their massive Thunderbolts not as fragile machines, but as platforms of overwhelming destruction. The first German dive came from the 6 o'clock high angle, weapons primed, and Hermiken's bullets shredded airspace in anticipation. The P-47s, however, were not static targets. Lieutenant Karl Hawk Hansen banked sharply, employing the Thunderbolt's superior roll rate despite its mass, using short, controlled bursts from his 8.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. Each burst unleashed over 400 rounds in under 2 seconds, saturating the space where German wings intersected, forcing the first FW-190 to veer violently to avoid catastrophe. Hermiken, accustomed to tight turn fights against Spitfires and Yakovlevs, felt the air currents jerk violently as his aircraft absorbed bursts aimed with terrifying precision. Smoke and metal fragments filled the sky, and for the first time, his laughter dissolved into unease. The Thunderbolts, though lumbering and initially slow to climb, converted mass into tactical advantage, diving with speed that negated German climb superiority, presenting a wall of lead at precisely calculated deflection angles and absorbing glancing hits that would have destroyed lesser fighters. At 400 yards, the concentrated firepower was a nightmare of synchronized destruction. One pilot estimated that 3 rounds per second were effectively shredding enemy control surfaces. Another observed the first FW-190's aileron ripped from its frame as if paper-thin. The Luftwaffe's doctrine, perfected over years of European combat, failed to account for the durability and firepower of the Thunderbolt. Every German ace realized that the P-47 could take punishment and still return fire with lethal accuracy, a combination that defied all their preconceptions. As engagements intensified, Hermiken's wingman attempted a classic high-side intercept, only to be caught in a crossfire that shredded his rudder. Smoke poured from his engine cowling. He had to abandon the attack, spiraling away to regain control. The Americans, guided by Major Blaze's disciplined formation tactics, anticipated every maneuver, trading altitude for controlled dives, keeping engines at peak RPM, and letting the FW-190s exhaust themselves chasing targets that could simply shrug off hits. The drama unfolded not in seconds, but in miles of airspace. A theater of rolling clouds, contrails, and the incessant roar of radial engines punctuated by bursts of synchronized gunfire that seemed almost elemental, like a storm unleashed. Pilots reported the shock of seeing their rounds actually damage the enemy before the enemy could even respond, a reverse of every lesson drilled into them in flight school. Even those still learning the nuances of throttle management, prop pitch, and coordinated attacks experienced a perverse sense of confidence as each evasive maneuver, each concentrated burst of .50 caliber fire, yielded measurable results. One German fighter trailing smoke, another veering off course, and in one instance, a full engine shutdown as oil lines were ruptured by precision firing. Above all, the Luftwaffe's psychological armor began to crack. Hermiken, a veteran of countless engagements, realized that no amount of tactical cunning could overcome the P-47's resilience. The familiar dance of dive, attack, and retreat, the patterns that had defined his life as a fighter ace, was no longer guaranteed to succeed. Each dive became a gamble. Each maneuver risked catastrophic damage in an instant. The P-47's ability to absorb punishment, paired with their devastating bursts of fire, forced German pilots into defensive postures they were unaccustomed to, eroding confidence mid-flight and introducing hesitation at moments when aggression had once been instinctive. As the first skirmish unfolded, scattered among fields and forests far below, the calculated design philosophy of the Thunderbolt revealed itself in horrifying clarity. This aircraft had been engineered not merely to survive, but to dominate, to convert mechanical mass, raw horsepower, and ammunition capacity into tactical inevitability. By the end of the morning engagement, multiple FW-190s were smoking, a few spiraling earthward, engines torn apart by lead that could not be evaded. Hermiken, his pride bruised and his assumptions shattered, radioed his wingman with clipped urgency. acknowledging in a moment of rare candor that the milk bottles were no longer merely targets. They were predators of an entirely different order. The day would become legendary in Luftwaffe reports not for the audacity of German tactics, but for the sudden and terrifying revelation that a newcomer, a bulky American fighter, had recalibrated the rules of aerial combat. Across the sky, from 28,000 feet to the patchwork of European farmland below, the first full realization dawned. The P-47 Thunderbolt, though unglamorous in design and seemingly ponderous in maneuver, had become unkillable when flown with discipline, intelligence, and the mechanical advantage of raw industrial might. The Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots, whose lives had been measured in precise calculations of turn radius, climb rate, and throttle response, now faced a lesson in humility and fear that would echo through every engagement for the next 2 years. Brute force, engineering foresight, and concentrated firepower could overwhelm tactical brilliance, and in the case of the P-47, it had done so with terrifying, undeniable effectiveness. By the time the formation disengaged, smoke trailing, engines groaning, pilots exhausted yet elated, the Luftwaffe had suffered a revelation it would carry with it to every corner of the European theater. The age of the P-47 Thunderbolt had begun, and no amount of experience or cunning would render it vulnerable to conventional attack. The air above northern France had become a theater of chaos, a maelstrom of roaring engines, screaming propellers, and the staccato of .50 caliber bullets ripping through the sky. By mid-morning, the Thunderbolt pilots had fully engaged their first wave of German fighters, and the reality of the P-47's lethality began to manifest in horrifying, precise detail for both sides. Major Donald Blay, standing out as the tactical anchor of the 335th Fighter Squadron, orchestrated the engagement with meticulous discipline. He had drilled the principles of energy fighting into his men. Every climb, dive, and turn executed not in isolation but as part of a coordinated ballet of destruction. The Germans, anticipating a slow, easily outmaneuvered opponent, initiated what they assumed would be a decisive pass. Oberleutnant Hermikin led a high-speed dive from 28,000 feet, banking sharply, his wingmen following close in classic dogfighting form. The initial assault was textbook perfect. German aces had perfected it over campaigns spanning France, Poland, and the Eastern Front. Yet, almost immediately, the illusion of superiority shattered. Lieutenant Karl Hawk Hansen, still learning the nuances of his Thunderbolt, executed a downward deflection burst, squeezing the triggers on his 8 Browning machine guns in perfectly timed succession. The effect was instantaneous. Tracer rounds lanced through the air, cutting into Hermikin's leading FW-190, tearing away ailerons and ripping through fuselage panels. Hermikin's wingman, attempting to flank Hansen, found his control surfaces riddled with holes, smoke pouring from his engine, forcing him into a steep climb to stabilize. The P-47's sheer structural mass absorbed near misses that would have shredded any other fighter, allowing the Americans to maintain formation while inflicting catastrophic damage. From below, the French countryside blurred under a tapestry of contrails, smoke, and fragments as the battle escalated into a full-scale confrontation. What the Luftwaffe pilots had underestimated was the combination of raw firepower, dive speed, and resilient design that the P-47 provided. Every attack they attempted met a wall of bullets. Every evasive maneuver by the Thunderbolts converted kinetic energy into offensive opportunity. Lieutenant Richard Viper Kane, flying his first combat sortie, found himself in a surreal ballet, diving to evade a high-speed pass, pulling hard on the yoke, feeling 6 GS wrench through his body, yet still lining up a shot at a climbing FW-190. He squeezed the triggers, unleashing a torrent of lead that shredded wings and ignited the German pilot's fuel tank. Kane's first kill, a feat he had only studied in manuals, was realized in a split second of pure adrenaline. Across the formation, the same story unfolded. Pilots, some barely 20 years old, were executing maneuvers that traditional dogfighting manuals had labeled impossible for such large aircraft. Yet, in the hands of disciplined pilots leveraging industrial design, the Thunderbolt became a predator of extraordinary efficiency. The Germans, trained to exploit agility, experienced a collective shock as their attempts to turn inside the P-47 were futile. The Thunderbolt's superior dive speed allowed them to disengage, reposition, and counterattack with a lethal precision that seemed almost preternatural. Hurricane's squadron, previously confident in their superior airframe and skill, found themselves forced into defensive spirals, climbing away from attacks that should have been routine. The sky was a maelstrom of tracer fire, smoke, and spinning aircraft, yet the Americans maintained cohesion, their formation acting as a mobile shield and a platform for concentrated destruction. One after another, German fighters were forced into spirals, smoke trailing from their engines, control surfaces shredded, pilots scrambling to maintain altitude and control. It was in this moment that the Luftwaffe realized a devastating truth. They were not merely encountering a new aircraft. They were facing a redefinition of aerial combat. The Thunderbolt's philosophy, resilience over finesse, mass over maneuver, and overwhelming concentrated firepower, rendered conventional dogfighting tactics obsolete. Pilots like Hansen, Kane, and Blay were not only surviving. They were dictating the terms of engagement, turning what should have been a massacre of inexperienced pilots into a series of systematic victories against seasoned adversaries. Hurricane, recognizing the unexpected ferocity and resilience of the Thunderbolts, attempted to adapt. He called for coordinated attacks in rolling formations, attempted cross-cover maneuvers, and tried diving attacks from higher altitudes. Each adjustment was met with the same devastating counter. The P-47's, unflinching under fire, returned precise, synchronized bursts, breaking up German formations and forcing retreats. Reports later documented that in the first 10 minutes of engagement, the Americans had downed more FW-190s than most Luftwaffe units expected in a full sortie, and several others were forced to withdraw with crippling damage. The psychological impact was immediate and undeniable. For the first time, the German aces experienced fear, hesitation, and confusion in the presence of a new enemy they had underestimated. No amount of prior experience could have prepared them for the combination of brute mechanical resilience and tactical discipline displayed by pilots in these seemingly awkward, yet deadly, flying milk bottles. By the end of the engagement, the sky bore the scars of violent confrontation. Torn aircraft wings drifting earthward, plumes of smoke marking the trails of forced retreats, and the unmistakable imprint of American industrial power realized through precise aerial execution. Major Blay, surveying the aftermath from altitude, understood that this was more than a tactical victory. The Thunderbolt had not only survived, it had proven a doctrine that mass, firepower, and pilot coordination could defeat speed, agility, and even decades of combat-hardened experience. The Germans, forced to retreat and regroup, radioed reports filled with disbelief and panic, phrases that would echo in Luftwaffe records for months to come. Milk bottles, they muttered under their breath, no longer mockingly, but with fear, a recognition that the P-47 was no longer a target to exploit, but a force that commanded respect, awe, and terror in equal measure. That day, in those skies over France, the P-47 Thunderbolt had not just survived its baptism by fire. It had demonstrated unkillable dominance, proving that industrial logic, concentrated firepower, and disciplined pilot execution could overturn assumptions, destroy pride, and redefine the rules of air warfare in Europe. The psychological and strategic ramifications would resonate long after the smoke cleared, establishing the P-47 as a cornerstone of Allied air superiority and leaving the Luftwaffe grappling with a new, brutal reality. The age of the unkillable American fighter had begun. As the smoke and debris from the morning engagement began to drift across the French countryside, A profound shift had already taken root in the minds of both sides. The Luftwaffe pilots, previously brimming with confidence, now flew with a tentative caution, their pride bruised and their assumptions violently challenged. Oberleutnant Ralph Hermican, a veteran ace who had survived campaigns across multiple fronts, realized that the rules of air combat had changed irrevocably. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once dismissed as a lumbering, overweight curiosity, had proven itself in the crucible of combat not merely as a machine capable of surviving attacks, but as an instrument of calculated destruction that could systematically dismantle even the most skilled and experienced German pilots. Reports later described the stunned German formation struggling to maintain cohesion, as repeated attacks from concentrated American firepower forced them into defensive spirals and chaotic retreats. The notion that agility and precision alone could dominate the skies was now obsolete. Mass, durability, and overwhelming offensive capacity had rewritten the code of engagement. Major Donald Blay, whose strategic foresight had guided his squadron through the engagement, understood that this battle was a precursor to the broader transformation of aerial warfare over Europe. The Thunderbolt's design, which emphasized structural resilience, high-altitude performance, and an unparalleled volume of fire, allowed pilots to impose a new form of psychological pressure on the enemy. German aces who had once prided themselves on their tactical brilliance now faced the reality that each engagement carried an unprecedented level of risk. A single miscalculation, even by the most seasoned pilot, could result in catastrophic damage or death. Within hours of the engagement, Luftwaffe Command began analyzing the encounter in detail, attempting to discern how a seemingly ungainly aircraft could so thoroughly dominate a formation of elite fighters. Tactical manuals were revisited, flight doctrines reconsidered, and new training directives drafted, all in an effort to counteract what they now recognized as a profound mechanical and strategic advantage. Meanwhile, the P-47 pilots, still absorbing the adrenaline and shock of their first major encounter, reported a mixture of exhilaration and disciplined reflection. Every pilot understood that their aircraft was not merely a tool of survival, but a weapon designed to impose control over the skies. Lieutenant Carl Hansen, who had claimed his first kill in the opening minutes, noted in his log the almost surreal sensation of piloting a machine that could absorb punishment, retaliate with unmatched precision, and impose psychological dominance over seasoned adversaries. The broader strategic implications of this encounter were not lost on Allied commanders either. The success of the Thunderbolt in this single engagement validated Republic Aviation's industrial approach. That sheer manufacturing capacity, combined with thoughtful design emphasizing mass and firepower, could overcome numerical inferiority or tactical experience on the part of the enemy. Within months, the 56th Fighter Group's P-47s would be recognized not only for their survivability, but also for their unprecedented kill ratios, fundamentally altering Luftwaffe planning and contributing directly to the erosion of German air superiority over occupied Europe. The psychological effect rippled beyond the immediate battlefield. Luftwaffe aces began to report increased hesitation during subsequent sorties, an uncharacteristic caution that betrayed their growing fear of the Thunderbolt. Propaganda among German units shifted subtly, references to milk bottles evolving from mockery to dread, as pilots came to understand that the aircraft's formidable firepower and resilience made it a lethal opponent under any circumstances. Historian accounts later emphasized that this shift marked a turning point in the air war over Europe. The P-47's victories were not merely tactical, but fundamentally strategic, undermining the Luftwaffe's confidence, disrupting traditional dogfighting doctrine, and providing the Allies with a platform capable of sustaining prolonged offensive operations with minimal attrition. Industrial logic, the meticulous synchronization of firepower and pilot discipline had proven decisive. Beyond statistics and kill counts, the engagement highlighted a critical lesson in modern warfare. Technological and manufacturing superiority, when paired with trained and adaptable human operators, could rewrite the expected outcomes of conflict, even against an enemy long considered superior. By the time the Thunderbolts returned to base, engines smoking but fuselages largely intact, pilots disembarked with an acute awareness of what had been accomplished. This day, the day the Luftwaffe realized the P-47 was unkillable, would not only enter squadron lore, but would echo across Allied planning rooms, influencing production priorities, combat tactics, and the psychological framing of air operations for the remainder of the war. The battlefield lesson was unequivocal. The combination of mass, firepower, and strategic pilot execution had established a new benchmark for aerial combat, rendering the concept of a fragile fighter obsolete. The P-47 Thunderbolt had arrived as a behemoth, underestimated and mocked, yet it emerged from the morning skies of northern France as a harbinger of a new era in air warfare, a testament to the deadly fusion of industrial ingenuity, tactical foresight, and raw mechanical might. The Luftwaffe's shock, the pilots' awe, and the ensuing strategic ripple effect collectively forged a legacy that would redefine air superiority, not just for the remainder of World War II, but for decades of aerial combat doctrine yet to come. By the time reports were compiled, analyzed, and transmitted across command networks in Germany and the United States, one fact was abundantly clear. The Thunderbolt was no longer merely an American fighter. It was an unkillable force, a symbol of industrial and tactical supremacy that would haunt the skies over Europe and leave an indelible mark on the history of warfare.